While Washington is celebrating the downfall of Syrian President Bashar Al-Assad, a known dictator who ruled for 2 decades, Al-Qaeda-linked rebels ousted Assad this past weekend, earning praise from President Biden and President-elect Trump. Now, Trump did say that Syria is not our fight and the U.S. should stay out of it.
Nevertheless, independent journalist Michael Tracey argues that Assad's downfall is in fact the US's handiwork. As he writes in a new piece for Newsweek, quote, "Achieving regime change by willful infliction of civilian suffering and pummeling a bothersome government into collapse will surely warm the hearts of regime changers who populate DC, whether they brand themselves liberal internationalists or under the increasingly malleable label of America First."
Has Washington yet again achieved regime change, helping to oust a secular dictator and installing a terrorist-sympathizing regime? We've certainly been here before. Joining us now to discuss is Michael Tracey himself. Welcome back to Rising.
A pleasure as always.
Why don't you start by making your case for why this, the downfall of Assad, is in fact something the U.S. was involved in? Because, so far the conversation from a lot of mainstream media figures has been, well, we didn't even have anything to do with this one, so you can't blame America for doing. They did this on their own. So what can you say? What is your response to that?
Well, one of the fallacies when you're asked to make this case is that you immediately get accused of denying the agency or autonomy of individual Syrians who might be supporting this overthrow or have participated in it. I'm not doing that. Obviously, for an event as seismic as the collapse of the Syrian state, which, according to Patrick Coburn in an article that he published, I think a day or two ago in The Independent, a long-time Syria observer, reported there extensively. This is the biggest political earthquake in the Middle East since the Iranian Revolution of 1979. So, of course, the causes are not going to be monocausal, but one cause, it seems to me, has to be the fact that, for example, the United States has imposed what it's long bragged are crippling sanctions on Syria, specifically with the intent of hollowing out the Syrian government, diminishing its state capacity, and basically causing enough suffering and dislocation that eventually the government will be so destabilized that something like this could eventually happen. So in 2020, Donald Trump imposed, at the direction of Congress, but then also the executive obviously gets a wide degree of discretion in terms of how it effectuates sanctions. The Trump administration imposed a series of incredibly sweeping sanctions under the banner of the Caesar Civilian Protection Scheme. Mm-hmm. That's what they termed it. And of course, in classic quote-unquote Orwellian fashion, the nature in which the civilians were supposedly protected was to inflict suffering on them by preventing the ability of any Syrian or non-Syrian from contracting with any Syrian state agency to engage in reconstruction efforts. This is after the country had been ravaged by war for well over a decade. And according to this sanctions regime that the U.S. imposed under Trump and then Biden continued, the purpose was to eventually breed enough dissatisfaction with the Syrian state that there would be some potential regime change action. So does the United States have to coordinate or orchestrate every little movement of the encroaching Syrian rebel offensive or militant offensive in order to have been involved? No, of course not. And then Trump, amusingly, goes on Truth Social after the downfall of Assad and says the United States ought not to be involved, which doesn't really mean anything because who was proposing that the United States get involved to, defend Assad? He was just kind of rebutting a straw man there. And
well, but could that be that?
Trying to mention that under his administration, the U.S. at Trump's direction were involved in seizing and diverting Syria's natural resources like oil and wheat, so that the revenues could not go to the Syrian government and not be used to reconstruct any state capacity. And with the Syrian government's rapid collapse, it was clear that the Syrian state capacity had been extremely diminished. And I think it would be bizarre to deny that the U.S. sanctions were a significant cause of that.
Sure. Could the declaration by Trump not to get involved, refer to future activities as the, new shape of whatever Syria's governance comes into being, something that I think it is reasonable to be concerned about as the fall of dictators in other Middle Eastern countries what has followed has been more terrorist sympathizing regimes or regimes that are more hostile to the U.S. and all that coming into play. Trump saying we should be hands off. What do you expect to see from U.S. policy or from the shape of the next Syrian government?
Well, I mean, part of Trump's political genius is he could just throw out these vague statements and people feel validation from them, whatever their predisposition is in terms of how they view Trump. Like if you style yourself a non-interventionist, quote unquote, then that sounds like a great statement. But is Trump against the Biden administration bombing what it claims are ISIS targets in Syria right now? I mean, to celebrate the grand liberation of Syria, what the U.S. and Israel have done is launch a giant tsunami of bombings in Syria. So is Trump against that quote unquote involvement? It would have been nice maybe at some point, if at some point over the course of the 2024 campaign, when Trump was on his podcast with all his friendly little interlocutors who were comedians and such and couldn't really be bothered to ask him a serious question, it would have been nice if at some point somebody had deigned to ask him, do you still hold to your belief, expressed very lucidly and clearly over the course of your presidency and even before, that the United States military should be indefinitely stationed in Syria to, quote, take Syrian oil? Like, what do you think about that now? I mean, I haven't seen any sign that Trump has revised that view. I mean, has he said that he's going to withdraw the remaining U.S. troops from Syria so that they're no longer seizing and diverting oil supplies? Not that I know of. So I don't know what Trump's statement is supposed to mean in practice. It seems like just this vague kind of sloganeering that is designed to kind of push certain political buttons, but really in practice doesn't translate to much that's substantive.
Michael, I just want to get back to the sanctions, excuse me, the sanctions issue for a second, and just sort of hone in so I completely understand exactly what your argument is. It seems to me there's an argument about sanctions whenever they're used, about their efficacy and about the degree to which they cause civilian suffering. And then there's a separate argument about trying to displace particular regimes. Now, I don't think there's really any dispute that the Assad regime in Syria was brutal and involved massive traducements of basic human rights. So is your argument that sanctions were the wrong tool to be used, or that the United States should not have got involved even to that degree? Because presumably you're not overly bothered by the removal of the Assad regime, or are you?
I mean, I have no particular sympathy with Assad, nor do I have sympathy with manifold other despots throughout the world. But in terms of U.S. statecraft, the over-reliance and almost addiction to sanctions is well established. And the impact of sanctions is also fairly well established, which is that when the U.S. imposes them as sweepingly and punitively as it does, the consequence is to inflict suffering on civilian populations. So if you feel like that's a justified means by which the U.S. can seek to topple bothersome or inconvenient governments, then I can see why that trade-off might be tolerable to you. But I don't know. My allegiances, so to say, tend to be with the people who take the brunt of this statecraft more so than like the grand planners in Washington D.C. who want to remake regions that are more favorable to their interests or perceived interests. Because we don't know, obviously, how this is going to work out.
Yeah, but sorry to cut across you, Michael, but I mean, the Syrian people take the brunt of the violations of human rights perpetrated by Bashar Al-Assad, don't they?
Sure, they took the brunt of that. They took the brunt of the depredations that were inflicted on them to other varying degrees by the militant rebel forces, and they've also taken the brunt of the U.S.-led sanctions regime, which deliberately inflicted civilian suffering by preventing any reconstruction efforts that would have required some degree of foreign investment. Because if you engaged in such efforts, then you were banished from the U.S.-led international financial system. So I'm not denying that the civilians or the ordinary people of Syria are the victims from multiple angles. It just happens that the U.S. is a perpetrator of at least one slice of that suffering, and it gets all washed away because people were so jubilant about a former Al Qaeda commander being installed as the new ruler of Syria. Whereas I think there should be some accounting of how that policy was effectuaed from the U.S. standpoint.
Yeah, that's the part of it where I come in. I have a slightly different view than both of you. If I thought that using U.S. sanctions to degrade it with the goal of replacing Assad was going to be in the best interests of U.S. security and the subsequent government was going to be more pro-U.S., I might very well support it. I just didn't see a reason to presume that in this situation, as we've learned this lesson in the Middle East so many times, which is why, like you, I remain with no enthusiasm for Assad whatsoever. Fine, good riddance. Who cares? Bad man, bad killer. I worry what the future of Syria will be.
But Robbie, on the issue of sanctions in particular, let's say that there's some relatively more beneficial outcome that arises from this regime change in Syria, and you can trace the U.S. sanctions policy as a precursor to that. I'm not convinced that what justifies the sanctions. I mean, why do we just kind of blithely accept the infliction of mass civilian suffering? Let's say Trump succeeded in imposing regime change in Venezuela in 2019 when he had sanctions imposed, and he almost got away with it. I mean, it almost worked. But is that a worthy trade-off for generating massive population outflows from Venezuela, migrant crisis? Same happened with Syria. I mean, people on the right love to bemoan migrant population transfers that result from these conflicts, where you have Syrian migrants flooding into Europe and elsewhere, and destabilizing those countries and causing cultural upheaval. Well, the sanctions are a contributing factor, because if people can't make money, of course they're going to be more inclined to depart from where they're living, whether it's in the Western Hemisphere or the Middle East. So I guess I question the acceptance of sanctions as a justified tool of statecraft, so long as they produce some outcome that is seen as beneficial to the U.S.
Well, I guess I would say I similarly don't know that I can provide an example where they have produced a beneficial outcome, so I would tend to be against them. And I also don't think the unilateral ability of the president on a host of issues, including sanction, is actually passes constitutional muster. This is an act of aggression that should be, authorized in an ideal world would be authorized by Congress, not just done at the president's discretion. So there's all of that too. Got to leave it there, but thank you so much for joining us. Provocative as always, Michael Tracey. We appreciate it.
All right, thanks a lot.